My brother banned my son from his wedding. Now my family says I'm the villain. Hello, read it. My name is Evelyn, and I am 42 years old. For most of my life, I believed that love meant endurance. That to be part of a family was to accept, to compromise, to forgive even when the wound was fresh. I told myself that bending was better than breaking, that keeping the peace was more important than being right, and that some people simply took more than they gave. I learned these lessons young. Growing up, my family revolved around my younger brother, Daniel. He was the son, and we were expected to orbit him without question. It was not that he was cruel, not in the obvious ways, but where I was expected to be responsible, mature, and accommodating, Daniel was given the space to be reckless, selfish, and inconsiderate. My parents never said it outright, but the message was clear. Daniel's needs came first, and mine were an afterthought. I was the one who cleaned up after his mistakes, the one who smoothed things over when he upset someone, the one who made excuses when he forgot birthdays, broke promises, or inconvenienced others. I was the one who was told to be patient, to understand, to let things go, because family forgives, because he doesn't mean it, because that's just how Daniel is. It started small. He would take my things without asking, and I would be told to share. He would break something of mine, and I would be told it was just an accident. He would lash out in anger, and I would be the one sent to comfort him afterward. Over time, it became habit, his selfishness my silence. When I became an adult, I thought I had outgrown it. I moved out, built my own life, and tried to keep my distance. I met my husband and my son, James, and for a while I thought I had escaped the cycle. But family has a way of pulling you back in, especially when you have spent your entire life being the one who smooths things over. My parents always found a way to draw me back into Daniel's orbit. When he lost his job, I was asked to help him until he got back on his feet. When he broke off an engagement, I was the one guilt into checking on him, making sure he wasn't lonely. When he had financial trouble, I was expected to contribute. It never ended, and I did it again and again, because that's what I had always done. Because I was the responsible one, the one who kept things together, the one who made sure the family didn't fall apart. Because I was a mother now, and I wanted my son to see the importance of family, of standing by one another. I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself I was being a good daughter, a good sister, a good person. But looking back, I realized I was just falling into the same pattern I had been trapped in my entire life. The years passed, and Daniel never changed. He moved from one job to another, one relationship to another, always the center of attention, always the one whose problems required immediate solutions. My parents continued to protect him, to cushion him from consequences, to ensure he never felt the full weight of his actions. And then he met Claire. Claire was everything my parents had ever wanted for him. Polished, beautiful, from a good family. She had the kind of effortless charm that made people overlook things, the kind of grace that smoothed over rough edges. From the moment they started dating, my parents became obsessed with their relationship, treating it as though it was the most important thing in the world. I kept my distance. I had learned by then that it was better not to get too involved. But that didn't stop my mother from calling me constantly, updating me on every detail of their engagement, making sure I understood just how important this was for Daniel. This is his fresh start, she said. A chance for him to finally have the life he deserves. The life he deserves. As if the rest of us had just been stepping stones along the way. I listened, nodded, said the right things. I had perfected the art of keeping my emotions in check when it came to my family. Years of practice had taught me that it was easier to go along with things than to resist. I knew my place. I knew my role. But something had changed. I didn't realize it then, not fully. It was subtle, a quiet shift in the way I saw things, a slow unraveling of the belief that I had to keep giving, keep sacrificing, keep making space for my brother. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about James. James, my son, my anchor. My kind, observant boy who had grown up watching, learning. Who had seen more than I realized, understood more than I had given him credit for. He had always been a quiet child, one who listened before he spoke, one who noticed the things other people overlooked. And he had seen everything, all the times I had pushed my own feelings aside for the sake of my family, all the times I had let things go when I should have stood my ground, All the times I had let myself be treated as an afterthought. I didn't know it yet, but he had already made up his mind about what that meant. And soon, he would be the one to break the cycle. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. For most of my life, I convinced myself that my sacrifices were invisible, that my quiet endurance was something only I bore the weight of. But I was wrong. James had been watching. My son was not a child anymore. At 17, he was on the cusp of adulthood, standing at the edge of the world I had sheltered him from. He had inherited my quiet nature, my tendency to observe before speaking, but he had not inherited my willingness to accept mistreatment. What I had spent decades excusing, he had been silently rejecting. And when the wedding preparations began, the first real fracture appeared. The moment I heard Daniel was engaged, I knew what was expected of me. My parents wasted no time making it clear that this was to be the biggest event our family had seen in years. Claire was everything they had ever dreamed of, a polished, well-connected woman who would finally complete Daniel's picture-perfect life. They had always believed he was destined for something grand, something special, as if the rest of us were merely placeholders until his real life began. And now his moment had arrived. I did what I had always done. I listened, I nodded. I let them gush about the venue, the dress, the endless guest lists. I allowed their excitement to wash over me, even though I knew, deep down, that this wedding would be like everything else. It would revolve around Daniel, and the rest of us would be background characters. But then an invitation arrived in the mail. Just one. It was addressed to me alone. I remember standing at the kitchen table, staring at the thick, elegant envelope, my name embossed in gold lettering. My hands felt cold, my pulse an uncomfortable thrum in my throat. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. There had to be a second envelope somewhere, one for James. There wasn't. I reread the invitation, searching for his name. Maybe I had missed it. Maybe he was listed as my guest. But there was nothing. Just my name, a single invitation, a single seat. The realization settled like a stone in my stomach. James wasn't invited. I tried to tell myself that there had to be an explanation, that Daniel had made an oversight, that surely my own son, his nephew, had not been deliberately excluded. But deep down I knew. I had spent a lifetime making excuses for Daniel, smoothing over his selfishness, pretending that he didn't mean to hurt people even when he left wreckage in his wake. But this time, it wasn't me he had hurt. It was my son. I held onto the envelope for hours before I finally worked up the courage to tell James. Not because I thought he would cry or lash out, but because I knew he wouldn't. And that was worse. When I told him, his reaction was painfully quiet. He didn't get angry, didn't demand answers, didn't even seem surprised. He just nodded, shrugged, and said it didn't matter. That he didn't care. But I knew my son. The way he left the room, without another word, told me everything I needed to know. James had already stopped expecting anything from this family. And I, his mother, was just now waking up to the truth he had accepted long ago. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to call Daniel, to demand an explanation, to tell him that this wasn't right. But I already knew what he would say, that it wasn't a big deal, that it was his wedding, his decision, that teenagers could be unpredictable, that they didn't want any disruptions, that this was about maintaining the atmosphere of the event. What I wasn't prepared for was what came next. A week passed. Then two. My parents never mentioned James' exclusion, never acknowledged that anything was wrong. They continued on as if everything was perfectly normal, as if we were all expected to play along, to pretend that this was fine. And then my mother called me. Her voice was soft, careful, the way it always was when she was about to manipulate a situation in Daniel's favor. She spoke about how excited they all were, how the wedding was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime event. Then, her tone shifted, and I felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on me. James was being stubborn. He was being unfair. He needed to let this go. She told me that Daniel had done nothing wrong, that he had every right to decide who attended his wedding, that James was making this bigger than it needed to be. And then came the final blow. She wanted me to make James apologize. Not Daniel. Not the adults who had excluded a 17-year-old from a family event. My son. Because according to them, the real problem wasn't that James had been excluded. It was that he had taken offense. It was that he had refused to pretend it didn't hurt. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother for exactly who she was. A woman who had spent her entire life bending over backward for her son at the expense of everyone else. A woman who had told herself that Daniel was special, that he deserved to be forgiven over and over again, no matter how many people he hurt. A woman who had raised me to believe that my pain, any pain that wasn't Daniel's, was insignificant. And now, she wanted me to teach my son the same lesson. I was supposed to sit James down and tell him that he needed to be the bigger person, that he needed to put family first, that he needed to forgive his uncle even though his uncle had not even acknowledged his absence. And for the first time in my life, I said no. I did not argue. I did not try to make her see reason. I simply told her no, and I hung up the phone. For the first time, I let silence answer for me. James had seen my silence as complicity for years, as proof that I accepted my place as an afterthought in this family. But not anymore. That night, I took the wedding invitation and put it in a drawer unopened. I was done being the one who made things easier for everyone else. The real battle hadn't even begun yet. But when it did, I would not be on their side. I had spent my entire life walking the tightrope of my family's expectations, balancing on the thin line between keeping the peace and losing myself in the process. But that line had finally snapped. The moment I refused to force James to forgive Daniel, the shift was immediate. My mother, who had spent years perfecting the art of controlling with subtlety, abandoned her usual tactics. No more passive-aggressive texts. No more carefully crafted phrases meant to guilt me into submission. Instead, she went silent. My father, who rarely involved himself in conflicts, withdrew as well. He had always been the type to go along with whatever made life easiest, and for decades, that meant siding with my mother and Daniel. He had never been unkind to me, never openly dismissive, but he had never defended me either. To him, family harmony mattered more than fairness, and if one child had to bear the burden of making that harmony possible, then so be it. I had long accepted that I was that child, but for the first time, I wasn't playing my part. And my father's response to my defiance was the same as it had always been, avoidance. And Daniel? Daniel did what he had always done. He dismissed it entirely. In his mind, I had overreacted. James was just a kid. This was just a wedding. It wasn't that deep. He didn't have time for family drama when he had a honeymoon to plan. He had gotten everything he wanted, a perfect day, a perfect bride, a perfect narrative. What did it matter if a few people were left behind? In his world, people either played along or they became irrelevant. And that was what he had decided: we were irrelevant. James was watching all of it. He didn't say much about it, and I didn't press him. I had spent enough time swallowing my own feelings to know that pushing him to talk would only drive him further into himself. He didn't bring up the wedding again, and I followed his lead, hoping that if I let the silence hold, it would soften the edges of his hurt. But silence does not erase wounds. It only buries them deeper. I could see the tension in his posture whenever he heard my phone buzz, the way he stiffened when I answered calls from my parents. He was waiting, bracing himself for whatever came next. What came next was exactly what I should have expected. The wedding was a week away when my mother called me again. This time, her voice was different. Not soft, not coaxing. There was a steeliness to it, a quiet fury that simmered beneath the surface. She told me that I was ruining the family, that I was being dramatic, that I was allowing James to fester in resentment, that I had a responsibility, not just as a mother, but as a sister, to make things right. And then she told me something that made my stomach turn. James wasn't the only one who had been excluded. Claire's side of the family had been given more seats than Daniel's. It wasn't just James who had been cut. It was several of Daniel's own cousins, a few distant relatives, even an old family friend. The seating was tight, the venue exclusive. But the difference was everyone else had accepted it. They had smiled, congratulated Daniel, wished him well. They had taken the exclusion as a minor inconvenience, something not worth fighting over. And now, I was the only one making an issue out of it. I realized then that this wasn't about James at all. It was about control. Daniel and Claire had crafted a perfect wedding, a vision so carefully curated that even family had become disposable. And my refusal to play along, to accept this slight with quiet grace, had made me the problem. It wasn't just about James not being there. It was about the fact that we weren't pretending it didn't hurt. And that was unacceptable. I told my mother I wouldn't be attending. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in a voice colder than I had ever heard from her, she told me that if I did this, if I missed my own brother's wedding, I was the one who would be tearing this family apart. Not Daniel. Not the people who had chosen to exclude their own blood. Me. The conversation ended without resolution. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. The wedding day came. The family group chat was flooded with photos. Daniel and Claire standing in front of a lavish floral arch. My parents beaming at their golden son. The reception glittering with expensive decor. The captions were cheerful, filled with phrases like a perfect day and a wedding to remember. I ignored the messages, but James saw them. He didn't say anything, didn't react, but I saw the way his fingers tightened around his phone before he set it aside and walked away. We spent the day at home. It was a quiet day, an ordinary day. But in the quiet, something was shifting. The ties that had bound me to my family, the invisible threads of obligation, were unraveling. And I wasn't sure if that scared me or freed me. But the storm wasn't over. 3 days after the wedding, my mother showed up at my house unannounced. She never did that. My family had never been the kind to just drop by. Every visit was planned, structured, expected. So when I opened the door and saw her standing there, I knew something was wrong. She didn't look angry. She looked determined. I braced myself for another lecture, another plea for me to see reason. But she didn't start with accusations. Instead, she told me that Daniel and Claire were planning a post-wedding family dinner, a private event, only for immediate family members. And this time, James was invited. It was an olive branch, she told me, a chance for James to move forward, for us to put this behind us, a way for our family to heal. But I saw it for what it was, a test. If we went, it meant we were willing to let this go, to forgive without an apology, without an acknowledgement of what had been done. It meant we were willing to accept the rules of this family, to fall back into place, to swallow our hurt for the sake of keeping the peace. If we refused, then the war that had quietly simmered beneath the surface for years would finally erupt. James didn't say anything when I told him. He just watched me waiting. I thought about every moment that had led to this. Every time I had told myself that family was worth sacrificing for. Every time I had swallowed my pride to keep Daniel happy. Every time I had accepted being an afterthought because it was easier than fighting. I had spent my life making myself small for the sake of this family. I wasn't going to do the same to my son. I told my mother no. And this time, I knew there would be consequences. The moment I told my mother no, I knew I had crossed a line that could never be undone. There had been moments in the past where I had resisted, where I had pushed back just enough to make them reconsider their approach, but never like this. Never a firm, unwavering rejection. Never a refusal without the usual backpedaling, without the guilt that came afterward. She stood at my doorstep for a long time, as if waiting for me to change my mind, as if expecting me to falter, to give in the way I always had before. But I didn't. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She gave me a single nod, turned, and walked away. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences before. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't a tool meant to manipulate me into feeling guilty. This time, it was a silence of finality. And that was when I knew. I wasn't just being temporarily exiled. I was being cut off. I tried to pretend it didn't bother me, that I had expected it. But no one is ever truly ready to be made an outsider in their own family. I had spent my life bending, compromising, making myself smaller just to stay within the circle of their acceptance. And now, for the first time, I was standing outside of it. James, as always, was quiet about the whole thing. He didn't ask me what had happened when I came back inside. He didn't ask if I had changed my mind. He just nodded, like he had already known what my answer would be. And that was what hurt the most, not the exclusion, not the rejection, but the fact that my son had never expected anything else. For days, the silence stretched. I heard nothing from my parents, nothing from Daniel. The group chat that had once been filled with updates about the wedding, endless messages about Claire's dress, and the honeymoon plans, went quiet. No calls, no texts. It was as if James and I had simply ceased to exist. And then, a week later, the storm hit. I woke up to my phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. The notifications came in waves. Missed calls, unread messages, frantic texts from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in months. My stomach twisted as I opened the first one. A post. A carefully written, public post from Daniel and Claire, detailing the heartbreak of family division, the pain of being abandoned during the most important time of their lives. The message was masterfully crafted, just vague enough to seem like it wasn't calling anyone out directly, but with enough detail to make it clear who the villains of the story were. Claire had written most of it. Her signature was all over it. The language was polished, the emotions curated, designed to evoke sympathy. It painted a picture of two people who had done nothing but try to bring their loved ones together, only to be met with coldness and resentment. And then, at the very bottom, one particular sentence stood out. We only wanted a peaceful, loving day, but some people couldn't put aside their grudges, not even for family. The reaction was immediate. The comments were flooded with condolences, outrage, messages of support. People who had no idea what had really happened were chiming in, offering comfort, validating their supposed suffering. And then, worse, some of my own family members were commenting, "You both deserve better." Some people just love drama. It's sad when jealousy gets in the way of family. The words blurred together, a sickening mix of pity and self-righteousness, twisting the narrative into something unrecognizable. My fingers clenched around my phone as I scrolled, reading the responses, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. I should have seen this coming. Daniel had never been the type to confront things head-on. He wasn't the kind of person to have a conversation, to hash things out in private. He was the kind of person who needed to control the story, who needed to make sure that no matter what happened, he came out looking like the victim. And I had given him exactly what he needed by refusing to attend the wedding, by refusing to play along with the carefully crafted illusion. I had given him the perfect opportunity to turn himself into the wounded party, to flip the script, to make it seem like James and I were the ones who had abandoned them, rather than the other way around. James had been in his room when I first saw the post. He must have woken up to the same flood of notifications, because by the time he came out, his expression was unreadable. He sat at the kitchen table, picking at the frayed edges of his hoodie sleeve, his jaw tight. I expected him to ask me what we were going to do. I expected him to be angry, to be hurt, to want some kind of response. But all he said was, "It doesn't matter." And that was what made my chest ache the most, because I knew that it did matter. Because I knew that even if he wouldn't say it out loud, he was feeling it just as much as I was. He had spent his whole life believing that family meant something, that it was supposed to be unshakable. And now, he was watching in real time as the people who were supposed to love us twisted the truth, painted us as villains, turned us into something disposable. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to respond, to set the record straight, to tell the world exactly what had happened. But what would that accomplish? Daniel and Claire had already won the narrative. Anything I said would only add fuel to the fire. And yet, even as I sat there, trying to figure out what to do, I knew this wasn't over. Because there was one thing about Daniel that I had learned over the years. He never truly let things go. If he felt like he had been wronged, even in the smallest way, he would find a way to make the person pay for it. And I had just committed the ultimate sin in his eyes. I had told him no. I had embarrassed him. I had refused to fall in line. And Daniel was the kind of person who always got even. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go this time. The fallout from Daniel and Claire's posts spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story had taken on a life of its own, mutating into something neither James nor I could control. Strangers, extended family members, even people I barely remembered from childhood were commenting, offering their unsolicited opinions. I had been naive to think that silence would shield us. Daniel had made sure we had no say in the narrative, no way to defend ourselves without looking like the villains they had painted us to be. The worst part wasn't the online comments. It was the private messages. Some were disguised as concern, people pretending to reach out to understand my side of things, only to lace their words with subtle accusations. Others were blatant, filled with anger and disappointment, demanding to know how I could be so cruel to my own brother. And then there were the messages from family, the ones that cut the deepest. You should have let this go. Blood is thicker than water. You broke this family, Evelyn. And yet, Daniel never contacted me directly. That was never his style. He preferred manipulation through distance, through control. He knew that by allowing others to do his dirty work, he could sit back and remain untouchable, the wounded victim who had simply wanted his family to celebrate with him. I kept waiting for James to break, to get angry, to demand that we respond. But he never did. He stayed quiet, too quiet. That was when I knew something was really wrong. I had spent so long worrying about my own emotions, about how this betrayal had affected me, that I hadn't stopped to consider what it was doing to him. James had always been observant, always been the kind of kid who noticed the smallest shifts in tone, the unspoken weight behind words. And now, he was watching as the people he had once trusted turned against us, as our so-called family erased us for the sake of maintaining their illusion of unity. I found him in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, his phone face down beside him. He didn't look up when I stepped inside. I could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers curled into his hoodie sleeves, the way his jaw clenched like he was holding something back. And then, in the quietest voice I had ever heard from him, he asked, "Were they ever really my family?" I didn't have an answer. I wanted to lie, to tell him that family meant something, that the love we once had still existed beneath all of this mess. But I couldn't, because love that comes with conditions isn't real love at all. I sat down next to him, my heart aching in a way I couldn't put into words. All these years, I had tried to protect him from this. I had tried to teach him that family mattered, that no matter what, we took care of each other. But now I realized I had been teaching him the wrong lesson. Family isn't about obligation. It isn't about sacrifice at the expense of your own well-being. It isn't about enduring mistreatment just to keep the peace. It's about respect. It's about people who choose to love you, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. And Daniel, my parents, the rest of them, they had never chosen us. They had only chosen what was convenient. James didn't say anything else. But when I placed my hand over his, he didn't pull away. And that was enough. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Daniel control the story anymore. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the truth to suit his version of events. But I also wasn't going to sink to his level. Instead, I wrote a message in the group chat, the same one that had once been filled with wedding plans and family updates. It was short, to the point, with no room for debate. I will not apologize for protecting my son. James deserved better than to be treated as an afterthought, and I refuse to teach him that his feelings don't matter. If that makes me the villain in your story, so be it, but I will not spend another moment chasing the approval of people who have made it clear that their love is conditional. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. And then I left the group. The relief that came after was almost immediate. There was no going back now, no repairing the rift that had been carved so deeply between us. I knew there would be more fallout, more attempts to guilt me into compliance. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. James and I weren't alone. We had each other, and that was enough. The final blow came a week later, when I received an unexpected email from Claire. It was polite, professional, almost detached in its wording. She didn't acknowledge the situation outright, but the underlying message was clear. Daniel was upset that I had cut ties, and she wanted to know if there was any way to move forward. Not for reconciliation, not for healing, but because Daniel hated losing control. I stared at the email for a long time before finally typing a single sentence in response. We already have. And with that, I blocked her email, turned off my phone, and walked away from the wreckage of the family I had spent my whole life trying to hold together. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next, because now I was free.